Go ahead. I have to think.
Before that time, I had a feeling that men had important lives and women did not. And after that, I did not see things that way.
I thought I knew a little bit about the struggle for women's equality. I knew nothing. I mean, I read books and books and books and books. Sisterhood is global, sisterhood is powerful, and everything in between, Betty Friedan, and so on.
What I realized as I read people like Simone de Beauvoir, for instance, was that there was a different way of living and thinking about yourself.
I think women in general play a big role in the lives of others.
So women can teach each other so much if we'll just let other women into our lives and let them help us. I learned enormously.
I saw my life in different terms. So I was then about 50. I went back to school.
And everybody was learning. That was a neat thing about it. It was a real dynamite learning experience. I remember somebody saying at one point in time, I'm learning more from this than I did in going 4 years of college. So I think that could be true for a lot of us.
I could recognize myself in the stories of other women, and it was wonderful.
And it was just a whole different world for me.
I kind of fell into it, you know. It wasn't like something, oh, I'm going to plan out, I'm going to do this. It just kind of happened.
There were still, at that time, very few women professors.
It was a wonderful place to meet and grow with other feminists in not only in the university but in the Lincoln community.
All the stuff that happens in the legislature that has to do with women and women's rights and women's lives, and it's all those men deciding what's best for us, and we have to change that.
1 in 5 children live in poverty, and when you talk about poverty, it's for a family of 3. I'm just rounding off the numbers. It's $18,000 a year. Half of them live on less than $9,000 a year, and a quarter of them live on less than $4,500, $5,000 a year.
And we saw so much disquality, I would say, in the school system for children of color, the Native Americans and things, but we decided we could do something about it.
At that time, there was a lot of concern about a variety of things that were going on nationally, the Vietnam War, many other things. And so it did create a climate where people were challenging and questioning, and also there was also a climate for coming together and being collective.
And the diversity of women, you know, women from all kinds of backgrounds who came together on this journey.
And it was making sure that we were documenting what was happening. It was making sure that women were talking to each other and providing support and not being so isolated. And it was focusing on safety and what was the lived reality.
To be part of that, to know those women, to know women I would have never have had any contact with before. It just was like opening the doors and letting the fresh air in. It was wonderful.
It is a wonderful experience to have that connection with women and to say, together we can't be beaten. Together we're powerful enough to get a lot of stuff done.
It was also being together and being visible in the community as a force to be reckoned with.
If women can't speak up, somehow, through groups or with individuals or just their own legislators, it's possible that we will lose out. And that's what you seem to be afraid of. Mm-hmm.
issues were needing attention. There was nothing that didn't need attention. And there was a consciousness about it, and there were people ready to speak up, and people ready to listen, and people ready to act. And so it was a very exciting time.
We wanted very much to make the best use of our time. And there were questions about the structure of women's organizations that made us think a lot.
I knew Helen Busella. She was already on the city council when I ran for the county board. One of those changes was to organize the Commission on the Status of Women. And I thought it should be a joint city-county commission because, there's aspects that affect both the city and the county.
Helen Busella was looking for diversity on the commission, and she wanted somebody young. And at that time I was 25 or 26, I guess.
It was so exciting because we had such women leaders.
Most people at the time I was on the commission started out on a committee and learned the ropes of the commission, learned about the commission itself, and then learned about their committee and the issues that affected their committee, and then started to see how their committee fit into the whole picture of what the commission was doing.
And there were issues that we were all learning about. We didn't all have understanding of everything, from whether it was displaced homemakers to the issues of childcare, sexual harassment, employment, education, media issues, sexual stereotyping. There was, you name it, we found a place to talk about it and do something about it. In Nebraska, we worked in coalition with many women's organizations.
And many of them quite venerable.
We started a chapter of business and professional women.
Nova BPW was one that really stood out as an activist chapter.
And that was an offshoot of the Commission on the Status of Women, 1976.
And AAUW, American Association of University Women.
The League of Women Voters.
There was a group called the Negro Council of Women.
The YWCA.
People and organizations, all who really cared about the availability of high-quality educational childcare resources in our community.
And so we invented what was then called the Nebraska Coalition for Women,
which was actually formed to be a little stronger, have a stronger voice than what the state government commissions could have on some issues that were somewhat more controversial, and to be a little more political.
And we asked them if they would give us their activists, that they probably have some high energy people.
My interest really was in understanding more about, at the community level, how decisions are made about funding. You have, joint budget committees between the city and the county, you have state money, you have programs that might overlap but that serve distinctive populations or have distinctive missions. There are politics involved with it. There are dynamics that bring people into sharp conflict with administrative structures, with bureaucracies, with law enforcement, with legislators. How do you negotiate those positions?
We here in Lincoln, or in Nebraska, we were a group from all kinds of places and interests and so forth. And so yes, we were coming together to do all of that sort of thing, where we found a common pull.
The women's movement started, back on its own, aside from the civil rights movement, the suffrage movement, in the early 1900s.
My mother was a senior at Denison University in Granville, Ohio, and grandmother went to visit when she was graduating. Grandmother was in very tender, delicate health, but she was exclaiming that the janitor there in Shepherd's Hall could vote and she could not. And this was 1915. Women worked hard before they could get the chance to vote, which was in 1921.
That effort to work to get the vote, I think, really was really laid the groundwork for all the other activism that came.
Always voting was very important.
I became interested in making some kind of a change structurally in Nebraska's laws that would help women.
We had a contingent from Nebraska. Virginia Walsh was there in the front row, and we went and visited with our representative, Charlie Thone, at the time, soliciting his vote for the Equal Rights Amendment.
Nebraska has in its name, if you just single them out, ERA, and we all wore banners with ERA that were all stitched together.
It was a moment of opportunity. It was about a 3-year period, mostly during the administration of Jimmy Carter, when there was a welcoming climate at the national leadership. And we knew that probably could not be sustained forever.
One of the best projects, I think, was what we called Adopt a Senator program. And that came out of efforts of the coalition and the legislative caucus.
We did the Adopt a Senator thing for 3 years.
So maybe you'd get 5 or 6 women in a legislative district, and they would get to know the senator, and they would be the ones to carry the message and to, create a presence.
When you are talking to senators where they live, there's a different dynamic that sets up.
And it was quite successful. We had workshops and trainings on how to work with your senator, how to lobby.
And at the time, these uppity women were just asking for way too much. First you give them the vote, then they can own property, they can drive a car.
And they get their names in the phone book.
Right.
I mean,
what next?
What is this asking?
Right.
And I remember a particular senator from an unnamed region of the state who wouldn't allow any woman to speak until he knew her marital status and whether or not she had children. Wow. Now, those are illegal questions to ask in a job interview, but clearly in the political process reflected how he was going to take in information.
It was necessary. What we were doing was necessary. Did we win? Did we always win? I don't know that we had fun working.
We didn't keep score.
No, and we had fun working. We had to, what was necessary, we would work at.
And then with the growing resistance to civil rights laws generally in the country in the 1980s, that became more difficult to do. But we had a lovely lark.
The other issue, which was quite controversial at that time, seems unusual now, was the lesbian and gay women.
The Lincoln Legion of Lesbians was a group that was in existence when I came here in the late 1970s. A number of faculty at the university and a number of women's studies students were actively engaged, but so too were women in the community.
We wanted to advocate for them, but yet we really didn't know their issues, and oftentimes too, the folks looking at the Commission on Women thought that it was only about gay and lesbian women. Why would you need, and so the perception, the stereotypes were really strong and were not easily changed.
The capacity to live in your own home and not be removed by a landlord who was homophobic or not lose your job. Those are still guarantees that we don't have in the city of Lincoln.
I think in Lincoln, we felt often that we didn't have enough women of color as part of our effort, and that we needed to help address those issues.
And there were many women who were involved in church activities, because church back then was the center for many African American people. That was where we gathered and where we did things. So leaders kind of grew out of the church. I really didn't get involved with Mrs. Leola Bullock until after Mrs. Fletcher's death. And then after I got involved in NAACP. She was also involved in Nebraskans for Peace. So she was involved in those things that would benefit others. An advocate for education for children. She wanted them to get the best education that they could, and she wanted others, like the superintendent, the principals, to be aware of it, that she was a voice for young people in the community. Mrs. Shanks was an advocate. Her voice, she would always tell me, just tell them, just let them know what you're thinking. She would say, I'll write a letter, I'll write a letter. So she was busy, from my knowledge of her, in doing that. She would write letters, meet with leaders and say, this is what should be happening.
I think that we stand on the shoulders of some amazing people. Leola Bullock, and she was such a force in the community and a role model for women, but also a role model for men on how you could get things done and be a decent human being and really contribute to your community.
First woman for U.S. Conference of Mayors. She is the first woman for many things. Everybody loves Helen. She knows everybody. And back then, women were to be seen and not heard. There were a lot of people who thought that she should be home cooking. She was a strong, determined woman.
She always believed that the strength of government was in involving people in government and getting them on committees and asking their opinions and finding out what they thought about things. And that, I think, is something that, well, you see it all the time now. The mayor often asks the citizens what they think about this road problem or that problem.
She'd always been for the people, and she didn't care who you were. I remember, I think she was the first person that ever went to the Malone Center, first mayor.
People like Carol Broman ran for public office when, I mean, it was unheard of that a woman should be the county tax assessor. I mean, I don't think there'd ever been a woman in a position like that before. But she saw problems with the way taxation was happening in our city, and she was smart, and Helen said, that's what we need. We need a smart woman to clean up that mess, and it was a mess.
And she wanted to empower everybody to do what they could and be the best that they can, and she wanted everybody involved, no matter what it was.
That didn't happen then. Until someone like Leola Bullock lifted that up as a way to do government business, that didn't happen. So I think that is something we all have to remember, is that we were very fortunate to have that kind of leadership, and she's missed, you know.
She accepted everybody. She treated everybody with dignity and respect, and whether they were low income or high income. And I think she's a great role model.
I had served as president of the league, and people were saying to me, you know, you really should consider running for the county board because it's going to be very difficult to change anything from the outside. You need to have somebody on the inside to change things. So they finally convinced me, though I had never done anything in the political world. I had never worked on a campaign. I had never really didn't know what I was about to do.
I'm Charlene Maxey Harris, and I am the oldest daughter of Joanne and Albert Maxey. My mother was the state senator for Nebraska. She was also on the school board, and she was the president of the school board. She was an activist in church, and she became a voice that was very loud, a very clear, very passionate to make a difference, not only for African American students, but all students.
One of the things that happened during that time is that the city council seats had at one point had all been at large, and some of them ended up being from representing districts, which meant that people could really run for city council who were just people that people in the neighborhood knew. They weren't necessarily rich people with lots of resources. People in the neighborhood knew them, and so they could run for city council. They could walk their district. You couldn't walk the whole city. And that whole type of grassroots politics changed during that time. That was new.
We went. Some of us drove, some walked, and we just handed out plaques and everything from one side of town to the other. So it was like a door-to-door campaign. And we talked to each other personally to people and said that she was our best choice.
I was the first woman in county government. There had never been a clerk or a treasurer or anybody in Lancaster County government. And then I found out after I was elected that there'd never been a woman elected as a commissioner in the whole state of Nebraska. There'd never been a woman elected as a commissioner. So I was kind of glad I didn't know that until afterwards.
I was the first woman chair of the English department. And when I was interim dean, I believe I was the first woman dean of arts and sciences. And then I was the first woman executive vice president provost.
I ended up being the first female president of United Way.
When my mom she was appointed then to serve as state legislature. You know, it was nothing but very, very proud memories of her being in that spot, and it was just like, wow.
Our campaign was based on the need for change, that what I would try to do would be to open all the windows and doors in county government and let change come in.
One of the things that happened to change our community drastically happened in the early 70s. And it started out basically as people coming together in neighborhoods because they were upset about something. In the early 70s, there was like one neighborhood association, the Clinton Neighborhood Association. And the rest of us in all the other neighborhoods saw what they were doing and started coming together in our homes with like small groups of people and saying, well, I think we need to have a neighborhood association. Look what the Clinton people are doing. And there are things about the way the city treats us that maybe they wouldn't treat us that way if we stood together. So that's what began to happen. And I know the Near South Neighborhood Association started during that time and a number of others. We never dreamed we'd be part of the city plan. But then before you know it, they were asking us to sit in on committees and to be involved in city planning and how the comprehensive plan was put together. And I think those are all very important things that could have gone a different direction. Could have been more, certain individuals having strong opinions would have gotten a lot to say in how that turned out, but instead it was very broad-based and very widespread. And again, that's the leadership. The leadership of the community wanted people to be involved in their community, and they looked at the neighborhood associations as a way to make that happen.
I think women really need to continue to be, and I would encourage them to be engaged in social and civic issues. I really wish we had more women in Congress and the Senate. It's a pretty nasty place to be right now, but we do not have enough women running for office.
Community involvement is where we see feminist theories in practice, and we can test whether or not they're useful at this particular moment in time with this particular set of issues that are in front of us.
It's just harder, I think, for women because there are so many stereotypes. And, even after I was elected, one of my fellow commissioners would keep saying, well, Jan, if you'd ever had to meet a payroll, you'd understand. If you'd ever had, that was one of the incentives for me to start a business, because I was so sick and tired of hearing that I thought, okay, I'm going to start a business and I'll only have one employee, but I'll have a payroll.
It is very hard to be a candidate, and you have to raise money, and you have to have a tough skin, and it is not a pleasant process by and large. And it may be that women don't want to put themselves through that. I don't know.
I think they're afraid because a lot of women try and fail. They don't get elected, and so they're afraid to try. But, women do get elected. So you have to have the courage to try.
There were other changes that were starting to take place that were in the context of the quality of the relationship between a man and a woman in a family.
Even if we had voting rights, we really didn't have a lot of rights to have control over what was happening. There wasn't childcare. If you needed to work, there was no childcare. You didn't have reproductive rights. You didn't have rights to say, no one has the right to batter me if they're related to me.
Public awareness and that kind of public environment to encourage women to take control of their bodies and take control of their health. All of these kinds of issues were very big. Women's health care, it's everybody's issue, you know, it's not just about women.
The control of reproduction is always immense.
When I talk about birth control information being available, it might sound really silly because everyone knows about birth control now, right? I mean, you can get condoms easily at the pharmacy. Young women could not get condoms, nor could they get birth control pills at student health at the university if they were unmarried. It was hard to find a physician, and there were physicians in town who were comfortable providing birth control to unmarried women, but there were also many who wouldn't, and who would give you a good lecture if you asked for it. So it was a different world.
Women's names, along with their husbands, you couldn't get them in the Lincoln telephone book. You were Mrs. John, but you weren't Betty and John. And it took us forever, it seemed, to convince Lincoln telephone and telegraph back in those days that women should have their names so that they could read, so that if you were looking for a woman friend you'd met, you had no idea what her husband's name was, and you didn't know she shouldn't be attached to her husband like a piece of, like chattel, and instead have her own name and her own identity in the phone book.
Couples were getting divorced, and women had stayed home and raised families, and then their husbands divorced them, or there they are, and they don't have a way to support themselves. And I think part of it, the laws changed pertaining to no-fault divorce, and there wasn't automatic alimony, and so a lot of women, divorced women, were really finding themselves in serious poverty situations. So there was a federal act passed that recognized that and tried to provide a variety of support. And we worked to get the YWCA to have the Displaced Homemaker Center.
This was a bill that was needed to help provide resources for women who were divorced or they were widows and had been taking care of their kids their whole life. And then after that divorce, they didn't have any skills to go into the workforce. My mother sponsored this bill, and the bill passed in spite of a veto by Governor Exon at the time. And she gave testimony, went to DC, she went to China, she went a lot of different places.
Yeah.
But she was very, very instrumental in getting that across, and a benefit for women at a time where the world was changing.
One of the big bills that we had that we were also very proud of, we called it the Lazy Bankers Bill. And this was a bill where people own property in joint tenancy with right of survivorship, mostly married couples. And when one person dies, the other person inherits that property free of the separate debts of their deceased spouse.
Usually it was a man who would go and encumber the property with a loan, and he would not have to tell his wife that he was doing it. Well, we didn't like that.
Or get her signature.
He didn't have to get a signature.
Pretty much said, it's too much work for the wife to come into town and sign it, and that's why it's called the Lazy Bankers Bill.
And there were women whose husbands died who were stuck with being out of their homes because they didn't know they had a mortgage, and they were unprepared completely to pay the mortgage. But the law at that time was going to be they were responsible for that mortgage, whether they knew about and whether they co-signed or not.
So one senator described it to me. He said, well, Chris, this is just so farmers don't have to be embarrassed to go home and get their wives to sign their loans. And I was like, I repeated this to him just as he said it, kind of like.
Women in farm economics, we got involved with that.
And the farm women were really hugely helpful in explaining to us that their husbands could go into the bank, sign a loan on property that they were joint tenant, and not with any knowledge on their part. And then if they were not able to pay back the loan, the farm was lost and the woman didn't even know there was a debt on it.
The wife group had a telephone tree network, and they started calling senators every 15 minutes. They got a call from another woman in their district.
Every 15 minutes they sent a message called Senator Haberman, and he didn't want any more calls.
The fight was amazing, and because of the farm women in Nebraska who were very well organized, we were the advocates and we were there in the legislature, but their statewide network really brought tremendous pressure on local representatives, more so than we could have done just in Lincoln.
This was the first time anyone had beaten the banking lobby. We certainly have better services for women, protection for them and their children, and we have the laws pertaining to credit and insurance. I think a lot of those things that allow people to move equally in society.
The opening up of the workforce was probably the most cosmic factor, one that we couldn't really control at all. The whole job market for women has changed radically. Jobs for women were not very plentiful when we started.
When Sheila and I got out of the junior league and we announced to our friends that we were going to start our own business, some people thought we were nuts. I mean, what do you mean you're going to start your own business? But I guess we just felt like there was a reason for doing that, and I'm glad I was part of it.
When I was growing up, I was always taught, you have to be better. You have to work hard. You cannot go in on, because the playing field is not level. So I always had to do more. I knew that. I accepted that. I did that.
The Employment Committee did a survey of women in businesses and how they were treated. And they conducted employment conferences to teach women about their rights, job fairs to help women find jobs.
We did a lot of work for a while with businesses, helping them survey their employees to find out what the needs were.
People weren't even really aware of the contribution that women were making to the workforce, both because they had to financially to help their families, but also because they had something very, very important to contribute. And childcare was at heart of this. I mean, this was a very important part of it, because if there wasn't a lot of childcare available, these women would not have these resources and be able to contribute to the workforce.
Childcare, those two words, childcare, were not uttered by these lawmakers. They only would refer to it as babysitting.
I think one of the things that it's hard for people to visualize is how incredibly political and controversial childcare was at that time. That there were not a lot of childcare facilities. Most of them were in-home facilities, what was available, and the group educational childcare, for the most part, there was a lot of for-profit centers and not too many not-for-profit educational programs in churches and that kind of thing.
There was just a recognition that a lot needed to be done to improve the status of women, both as citizens and consumers, and just across the board. There was much concern about equal pay for equal jobs and equal access to employment, even, that was a problem back then. So there were lots of problems to work on.
When they inquired as to why the janitorial and groundskeepers made more money than nurses that were high skill working in cardiac or chemo, and by the way, women nurses were maybe made 50 cents more an hour after being there 10 years. They were told that those people were skilled workers. So this was like 1980 we're talking about.
I had gone to nursing school and came here and put in an application for a job.
And she's from Texas.
I'm from Texas. And they offered me a housekeeping job. And I said, I beg your pardon? This is not what I'm applying for. Well, he didn't have anything available. I said, okay, I was crushed. And then I went to a store. They had Kresge's downtown in Lincoln. Applied for a job. They gave you a quick little test. For 20 minutes, they said. I think I finished it in about 7 minutes. And there was another lady, a Caucasian lady sitting right like Charlene and I. It took her the whole 30 minutes to finish the test. And they told me they would call me back. And I went back to Kresge's about a week and a half later. That same lady was working behind the counter. You knew where you stood in the South, but in the Midwest was different. So it was very different. And I was very crushed about it. It got better.
Over time.
Over time. It took quite some time to get better. In fact, it was about 15 years, actually.
Things were opening up for African Americans as far as jobs. And of course, this was after the Civil Rights Act, and I was working full-time for child support, and I requested to go part-time so I could teach 2 classes at Lincoln High.
In those days, even though it may not have been legal through equal employment, women were still, had very difficult time getting certain kinds of jobs. In one particular woman who came to talk to us at a meeting, she had applied for a non-traditional position with a Lincoln utility, a public utility, and was told, we don't hire girls for that job. This was in the 70s. I mean, you know, when everyone knew that you couldn't do that kind of thing, they still did it, you know, so it was an awareness raising thing that needed to happen in terms of women's abilities to do all kinds of jobs, for everyone to be judged on the basis of your physical and mental ability to do a job and not who you were or what you look like.
I also worked with some railroad women who were being severely harassed. These were laborers. These women did really hard work on the railroad, and they would get into these tanks and scrub them out, and it was very dirty, hard labor. And almost all of them were on Valiant because they were so traumatized by the harassment. And the men would walk in on them in the showers, and they constantly referred to their bodies, and it was just the worst harassment I'd ever seen. And they came to us to get help, and we provided, you know, I think some good advocacy. But we also helped them address problems with their union, because the union was not dealing effectively with it, and the men were also mad. Long story short, the women took on some of the issues with the union, and in a big showdown meeting with them, they were elected to be the officers of the union. So it went from them being severely harassed to the men actually electing them to be leaders of their union. It was that was quite an amazing group of women who taught me a lot.
I was on the YMCA board, Young Men's Christian Association board, because I wanted to swim in their pool, which was a better pool than the YWCA. And at noontime, I wanted to go over there and swim. And we didn't have a women's locker room. And in advocating to the male board why they should be doing this, when of course their response is, why don't you go to the YW? I made a good business case for their facilities were better, surprised the men's facilities were better, and that they would gain so much in membership, how many new members they would gain, how much revenue this would bring in. And it worked. And that was in October of 1979, I think. But it's hard to believe that, yes, that women were not allowed, and I love the pool.
Education, we've made tremendous progress. That Equality in Education Act went way beyond what I think anybody ever imagined.
So teaching and education has always been a vital part of our lives.
When I went to college, as a female, you either were going to be a teacher or a nurse.
Or get married.
Or get married.
I mean, you were a teacher or a nurse, and then you'd get married. Or you'd get married right out of college, or you'd be the teacher or the nurse. I mean, that was it.
Well, I'd say the first thing about being a woman in the 1970s, and I started here in 1968, was that it initially was very lonely. There were not very many women faculty members when I joined the faculty. The English department, which had 55 tenure-track faculty members at that time, had 2 women on tenure-track.
One of my faculty members automatically flunked me on my doctoral comprehensives because his rationale was that women's studies was just politics, not scholarship.
The work we did was not really very accepted by our colleagues at the time.
Even though we were moving into academic positions, it would be contested.
And one of the handicaps we had as faculty in creating a women's curriculum is that none of us had been educated in a women's curriculum.
It was difficult for radical women scholars to find their way within the university. And everyone had to figure out not just how the academy operates, but how one operates in an academic environment when your intent is to lob grenades into the middle of it.
Title IX is huge change in people's lives.
The states had to implement those federal laws, and in Nebraska's case and in many states they weren't doing that very well. So we decided that we really needed to have a state Title IX. And we organized quite an effort to do that, and a grassroots lobbying effort. We had packets of information, and on the front of the packet was a picture of this little girl who was the daughter of one of our commissioners, holding a basketball, and she's really darling little girl with blonde hair and this big basketball. And one of the senators who saw this got up on the floor of the legislature.
And he was very much opposed to Title IX, and he thought it was very wrong that women should play basketball because they couldn't have babies if they played basketball.
Women can't play basketball.
He said, my sister played basketball, and do you know she never had children? And it was like, oh my God.
I mean, young women today that enjoy athletics in the high school area, competitive athletics, have no idea. But what did eventually occur and did happen was that athletic fathers had little girls and they began dreaming of them being athletes. And the parents' support then moved the school district further than it would have gone otherwise.
We would find out things like which senators had daughters who were in high school, and it was wonderful to see how interested a senator could become once his own child was involved. That's not to say that we didn't encounter a lot of bias, and we encountered ridiculous kinds of prejudices.
Women, I mean, the girls didn't have practice times in a gym, they didn't have uniforms, they didn't have paid coaches, it was volunteer, and it took a long time for it to become even recognized. I do fully remember the girls' first state high school championship at Bob Devaney. And in Lincoln East, wonderful, wonderful young team. It was the first time a girls' high school basketball championship had been in Nebraska. And I went and I cried. I was so happy for those girls.
Up until 1971, the marching band was all male. Women students in the music department actually brought this to our attention, that they were not allowed to be in the marching band. And the first one was that band uniforms cost $150 a piece, and they didn't have any that would fit women. Women don't really become band directors. They get married and have kids. A good marching band requires uniformity of gait, and women cannot keep straight lines. And we asked, why can't women create straight lines? And the answer was, they have these curvy bodies. So I called up Bob Devaney, and he said, I don't care if women are in the band. And I said, tell them that. And apparently he did. And the next year, women were in the marching band.
Opening that door for women has offered young women tremendous development and, I hope, preparation for the rest of life as well. So athletics was much more than just being able to dribble the ball. It did so much more for young women.
There had been a series of sexual assaults at Love Library in 1975. And a group of women students on campus got together to try to get the administration to do something about what was happening in the library and provide support for the women who had been sexually assaulted.
We identified what were the buildings that were unsafe, what were the concerns that women had going to the library, what were the concerns that differed for the residence halls and those in the Greek system. You can tell the students that we have cameras in the library. The Women Against Violence Against Women group on campus was able to get people to the table to admit that there was no film, that the cameras were just mock-ups, and that the sense of security that one might have from a camera is not going to move us forward in terms of addressing the concerns that students had on campus.
I think back to that time, and I think on campus where the police chief, everybody was involved in saying, we can't let anybody know about the fact that this is going on, because then parents aren't going to send their daughters to school here. Rather than, we need to know about what's going on here, and therefore we're going to keep people safer.
When I started on the commission, I don't think there was any crisis line, any shelters. Those things were all unheard of.
Is there a way we can have a corner and install a phone line here, and then people who are experiencing this rape would be able to call? And quickly it was discovered that it wasn't just women on campus that heard about it, it was women in the community that heard about the fact that this rape line was starting. And this would have been in '75. So across the nation there were a few crisis lines that had started, there were a number of rape laws that are starting to be passed, but before that they were really not good in any way respectful, safe laws for women around the area of rape.
As we developed those things was also getting the word out to women that those services were available.
When we took it out of just being a criminal issue and we put it into being a social issue and a health issue, it changed the way people were willing to talk about it. So to me that was a big change in our country. It is a crime. It should be a crime. People should be held accountable for it. But at the same time, it's an issue that we all need to be addressing, and nobody should be living alone having to deal with this, and there's been a lot of strides. With rape though, I think people still have a really hard time talking about sexuality, let alone sex and violence together. And most women don't want their husband, the father of their children, to go to jail for 50 years. It's, and our sexual assault laws, that's still on the books. It's first degree sexual assault is 50 years. We used to beg to have them make a referral to us. Now on the back of every single police officer's business cards, whether it's a traffic stop that they make or whether it's a anything that they might come in for an investigation or have contact, on the back of it is Voices of Hope's number. So to me, the difference in terms of how collaborations have improved has made a lot of things much safer for women that are in intimate partner violence.
I don't know that we've done a very good job of reducing violence. We've done a better job at identifying it and helping victims and giving them assistance.
It's always interesting to me that across the country you think, oh, is there one big agency or group that started this? And really it was individual women who were talking to other women who had experienced rape or experienced battering in their relationship with their husbands, who started talking to each other and providing support for each other, and then other women who were organizing around that. But it was really the courage of those individuals that had experienced it and were willing to tell their stories and figure out what would be useful in terms of protection and safety and respect and all of those things.
I do hear from our students, they reach a point, either as undergraduates or sometimes as graduate students, where they're very frustrated with having to turn around and work with people who still don't get it, who still don't understand the dynamics of patriarchy, of capitalism, of heterosexism.
And I think for young women in the 60s and 70s, we saw that happening everywhere. We saw so much injustice. It was so blatant.
I know that someone was there, maybe it was the women in the community in Lincoln, maybe it was other women's studies faculty members, maybe it was other women's studies students. They helped me move. And so that's where our future is, in helping people move forward, helping them to come to grips with what is oftentimes a very difficult reality.
I think there's still a lot of discrimination. And partially it's because it's the women that have the children, they're working, and frequently they're the ones that stay home.
Just the whole issue of economics and poverty continue to be largely women and children's issues.
The tension and the stress of being in poverty. And it's one thing our society has to deal with.
Not that men aren't in poverty, they are, but just because women often continue to be the primary caretakers of children, poverty affects them more dramatically.
I think now it isn't as obvious because there are some resources, but it's still so prevalent. I mean, I can't say that 1 out of 4 women are raped in their lifetime and not say that this is a major issue still.
When I was growing up, racism was there. We knew it was there. Nobody tried to hide it. But now I think with the young people that are growing up, it's hidden.
It's so easy to give up. And don't let color stop you no matter what. Keep on. You can make it. Just keep that in mind. No matter what comes against you, you can make it.
Maybe the thing is we need to be more supportive of our interests with the senators we have in the legislature. They need to know where we are, what we feel. We as women, no matter what our age is, they need to know that yes, we care about this, and yes, we are listening. And maybe that's what you mean by being aware.
Yeah.
I think the quote war on women that we saw a little bit in the last presidential campaign should be a real warning. And I'm glad to say that I do think some young women did wake up and say, whoa, you mean my way of life is considered unnecessary and the choices I have aren't considered to be important and can be taken away, but they can.
Don't ever think the fight is over. Don't think that for a second.
I see the real struggle since the Congress and the Senate is so divided. They're not supportive of women's interests particularly.
Not at all. We have the tools to understand and grapple with and challenge those and change those.
And we'd get discouraged and say, oh man, this is going to follow, this is never going to happen. And then we'd say, no, can't do that. We have to keep going and keep going and keep going. We don't want apathy to win.
I had the feeling that I somehow managed to color women gone for a lot of my youth. And I am sorry about that, and I'm trying to make that up.
I know this time frame from 1975 to now in our history is not very long.
Things do change. You know, they don't perhaps change as fast as you'd like, and certainly not as painlessly as you would like, but they do change.
I hope young women today can look back sometime like we are, like I am, and say, oh, that was really great.
You don't have to be the same people. You don't have to have the same party. You don't have to have anything that except concern.
You have to become a part of the things that you care about. So if you can have some passion for something, some empathy for another person and how they're dealing with it.
It's really important to be informed. You want people to understand that you know what you're talking about, that you have a basis in facts, and that you're responsible.
I see women's studies, and today women's and gender studies, as having that capacity to support people. We can't always make it a welcoming environment in and of ourselves. You can't change an entire university community, but you can create a safe haven.
There's nothing more fun, really, than being a part of a group of people who all are working towards the same thing and sharing the struggle, but also the joy of seeing change.
I think young women need to be where we were.
It's wonderful to be doing work that you really believe in.
It just meant so much, the friendships that were developed.
It isn't just about women, it is about all of human relations and all of our, collective selves and how we live respectfully together and honor each other.
And all those little steps, even if they don't result in absolute victory, are necessary to get where we've gotten today. And so human rights and civil rights are not finite. There's not a little pool of them, and if I don't grab mine, somebody else will get theirs and get mine too. Human rights are infinite. we can all be treated like human beings, fairly and with dignity. And that's what this all, I believe that's what the women's movement is about.
I are gonna have to work like the dickens to keep what we have.
So we have a lot of work to do.
Yes.
And we have a lot of hope that lots of change can happen.
And if our history and our stories can help, we're glad.